Colombia under attack. Two things. One is the attack on Hamilton Hall, the Palestinian Liberation Zone creating Jew-free zones, taking over offices. And by the way, this is not the 60s. So not only keep your hands off our Shabbos, but keep your hands off our 60s. You're not a protest movement. You're violent fundamentalists. The other attack is on the Columbia core curriculum. It's the center of my education, where you read just everything. Lidham, Homer, Sophocles, Aeschylus, contemporary civilizations, Plato, Aristotle, Locke, Hobbes, literary, art humanities. You learn how to read paintings. Wow. Rembrandt, Raphael, and the music humanities also, right? So where I started to learn how to listen. I mean, that's what you're really learning how to do. You're learning how to listen, you're learning how to see, you're learning how to read. Now, a guy named Joseph Howley is now in charge of the core curriculum at Columbia, and he's insisting on changing it. And essentially, what he's doing by introducing critical texts in the 19th and 20th century, he's turning everything before them into simply and only into markers of oppression. This text is homophobic. This text is racist. This text is sexist. So the greatest texts that our culture has ever produced just become part of a checklist. That's not called reading. Now, the humanities have been dying for decades. October 7th marked the death of the humanities, the death of the liberal arts, and the death of the university. And what's implicit in their way of not reading is that anything that came before us must be bad. We must cancel them. And there's the cultural forgetting that in order to really be creative and really be original, you must be in relationship. You must be in relationship to something that you've inherited that comes before you. If you parrot it or collect it, then you're just an antiquarian or somebody who is stuck in an obsessive cycle of, pathological belief. But that's not the only option. What I teach at Bar Ilan, and I teach my own literary humanities course. I don't call it that, but that's what it is. We read these texts, first of all, not literally. So when we see Homer representing a culture in which women are chattel and men only fight, we don't say stupidly, oh, Homer represents patriarchal culture. Read Homer carefully. I mean, I always say to my students, you want to see how women are gendered? How about the men? The men in Homer are almost always toxic. So one then has to see the relationship between the toxic masculinity that Homer represents and the representation of the feminine. But we never get that far, right? Because Homer's just a sexist. And Virgil, the great poet of empire, is just a propagandist, which is the furthest thing from the truth, because in this poem, which on some level celebrates Augustus, it's also an anti-war poem. What I do in my class is I ask students to take a figure from the ancient world, mythological, and to show the afterlife. What I mean by afterlife is how does that figure get sustained? So great presentations, one on Apollo, and Stravinsky did a ballet in the 20th century focused on Apollo. Another on, or several really, on the ways in which, on novels about Achilles, contemporary novels about Achilles, or contemporary novels about Circe. There are just a bunch of them out there. I mean, it's funny, while this is happening in Columbia, go into any bookstore and there are books, novels that focus on Circe, that focus on Achilles and Achilles and Patroclus. And that ambiguous relationship in Homer is turned to a homoerotic relationship in these two novels. So Homer then becomes a tool to explore ourselves today. Language is just a tool. If we lose it, if we use it as something that just limits us, the prison house of language, as a mediocre critic of the 70s and 80s wrote. Yeah, there is a kind of prison house of language, but there's also the possibility of transcendence. And the way we transcend is we take something that came before us and we find something inside of that that speaks to us, and that becomes a way of sustaining us. That becomes a way of transforming us. So looking back at Patroclus and Achilles, instead of being part of a museum of irrelevancy, they become a means. Their relationship becomes a means. About talking about contemporary relationships, love relationships. Poets, as every great poet knows, I think Shelley said are the great legislators of the world. Ben Jonson said poets and priests. Ezra Pound, the fascist. Oh, can we learn something that a fascist says? Yes. He said that the poet makes it new. That's the injunction. Make it new. And the paradox, and this is lost on those who attack the university. The paradox is that in order to make it new, you have to go back and claim something for yourself. Now, of course, and this is part of our Jewish liberal democracy, my classroom in Israel, those creative transformations can't be appropriations. You can't take somebody else's identity for yourself, but you can use literary texts, music, art to think of the past, to think about the present. So the attacks today on Hamilton Hall are an attack on the university. And we should remember that the same people who are attacking the university, they're attacking the Jews. You want to support liberal democracy? Support a democratic Jewish future in Israel.